Somebody like to open us with a word of prayer?
You are as you go for. It's a good feeling to a mother, huh?
Yeah.
Let's pray. Holy Father, I thank you for this new day, for this new opportunity to wrestle in your word as a family. I pray that this time together will sharpen one another, that the Spirit you give us will guide our thoughts and draw us into the truth. Father, I pray that you bless our discussion, that we may honor you as we talk to each other and as we pull from your word. In your Son Jesus, I pray.
We've been talking about interesting women in the Old Testament, both good examples and poor examples. I think so far we've only looked at good examples, which is fine. Just wanted to give you a little heads up into our plan here. So we could go on for a long, long time, because there are a lot of women talked about in the Old Testament as well as a lot of men. What we're thinking is that today will be the last day where we sort of take requests as far as women to talk about, and then we'd like to finish up this section of the study next week. And then the following week, we'll begin the next section of our study, which is actually New Testament. You could call them doctrinal foundations, the letters of Paul, and so on, New Testament prophecies. So this week and last week, at least, or this week and next week, at least according to our current thinking, will be spent in the Old Testament. And then after that, we'll start to go into the New Testament. Does that sound like a reasonable plan to people? So last week we talked about Esther, just to, I guess, kind of get us into the spirit of the class. A review of what we talked about. If you want to turn to the book of Esther and take a look at it, that would probably be a good idea. We did not read the whole book. We focused mainly on Esther's response to the disaster that Haman was planning to bring upon the Jews through the king, and how Esther figured into basically foiling that plot. So does anybody remember some of the positive character traits or characteristics of Queen Esther that we pulled out of that? You want me just to review them for you?
Oh, they're probably all on the board.
Huh?
They're all on the board
Right
behind
behind
you.
you.
Yeah.
But I think her wisdom was one of the big ones.
Yes. Her wisdom as reflected in the fact that, she was in a tough situation. She didn't want to run away from it, but she wanted to do the right thing. So she got advice from people who knew more than she did and acted accordingly. That certainly reflects wisdom. We pointed out that she was, we definitely would call her a brave individual. She did not run away from the situation. And there's certainly plenty of examples in the Old Testament and the New where people do run away from these kinds of situations. She did not, but she took it very seriously. She did look for a way out, but it was a godly way out. And ultimately she went to God. That was a very important point that we made as well. And she let other people in the community know what she was struggling with so that they could pray and fast for her. Another thing we pointed out was that in her position as queen, she did have some resources at her disposal. She had male servants who went and collected information for her. She asked, find out what's going on. She could not go certain places, but her male servants could. And I think the biggest point, probably, maybe not the biggest point, but a very relevant point for us living today, is that she held on to her identity as a godly person in a culture that was really very alien, a culture that didn't understand or agree with or teach in accordance with the way that she thought as a religious Jewish woman. So I think that pretty much encapsulates it, but is there anything else that people would like to add, maybe you thought about during the week, or questions that came up about what we talked about with Esther you'd like to talk about, or should we go on to the next person?
There was one thing that came out that was quite important to me was the place of law. Because when she went against the law of the people, they just offered, okay, you can go against the Jews too, but they're going to be armed and I'm going to arm them. So they were supported. It didn't change the law, it just changed the effect of the law, because they were trying to go to honor the Lord or honor the request that was made. Because everybody became their friends because of the change in what was going on. And I think that sometimes by obeying the law, we see the success of the law.
Now, in this case, you're talking about the Persian law, right?
Yeah,
The law of the
Persian law.
Medes and the Persians that cannot be broken?
Right.
Okay.
It was not broken, they just added new law.
They did, not Esther,
Yeah, yeah, the king
the
did,
king.
yeah.
Okay.
He did not say don't attack them, he said, but if you do, they'll be armed.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Throw one thing in there.
Go ahead.
Kind of our question frameworks, we've been looking at each of these individuals is that, you know, how does God use her in history? What role does she fulfill in God's design? And should her actions be an example for others or not? And I think in this particular role, as you go through the life of Esther, in the end, this pinnacle point that we were reading in chapter 4 last week, God used her along with other people, but she was a point person to actually save God's people. And yet she did it in a servant role as a wife, as someone who did not necessarily have power. She just had access, yet she used that to honor God, and in turn, because of her willingness and her faithfulness to stand up and do what's right, even when it might cost her life to go to her husband and say, hey, there's something going on here, she changed the course of history and saved. She was the one used to save God's people. So I think that's notable and interesting as far as we're looking at our walk of faith and the challenges that come and make that challenging sometimes.
Yeah, and we can reflect that upon ourselves. You know, you don't necessarily have to be the senator or the president in charge or the person running the company in order to have an influence. Sometimes the influence is in connecting the dots, which is kind of what she did. You know, collecting the information, finding out what was going on, going to the appropriate people in charge, letting people know what was about to happen. She was a kind of a go-between, a connector. And, you know, we see that as well, or we saw that in the description of a godly woman in Proverbs. You know, a woman who was on top of things, who knew what was going on. Didn't necessarily do everything herself. She knew what was going on. That's very important. So maybe we should go on to the next woman to discuss, which is up to you guys. I mean, have you thought about another female character in the Old Testament you'd like to look at? Andrew?
Queen Jezebel.
Jezebel.
Brought him.
All right. Why did you pick Jezebel, if I don't mind?
Because we've had all good examples of women, so it's time to get a bad one, I guess.
Okay. I think there is something to be gained in talking about the bad examples, particularly an extreme one like that. So I think that's good. So Jezebel is,
First Kings 21's a starting point, there's also before that.
Where?
First Kings 21 is one example of her and Naboth's vineyard, and probably gives the most color about her character there.
we might, let's see, so does that talk about, we might want to introduce her. So where is she described, for the first time? That's probably considerably back in Kings, right?
Yeah.
Ahab becomes king of Israel. Yes, okay, here, so, yeah. So 1 Kings chapter 16, verses, let's have somebody read verses 19 through 34. It's just kind of the historical backdrop and who Jezebel was and kind of what was going on at the time. Like to read?
Because of the sins he had committed, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and walking in the ways of Jeroboam and in the sin he had committed and he caused Israel to commit.
Where are you reading now? This one?
Kings 16:19.
That's what you told me.
Yeah, that's what you told.
I
You
said-
mean 29, right?
I'm sorry. See my old brain. 29.
In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab son of Omri became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab son of Omri did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. In Ahab's time,
Oh, okay. So we're going to talk about Jezebel. What in this backdrop that we just read is useful? And we can already start to talk about role appropriateness here. In particular, I'm thinking the Genesis story. I see that echo here with Adam and Eve. So
Apparently she let him go worship the Baals.
it looks like she had a lot to do with it, doesn't it? Now, I don't know what his religious persuasions were before. Evidently, they weren't very strong, whatever they were. But yeah. So that's definitely a problem. He didn't do what God wanted Adam to do. He didn't push back and say, no, that's not a good thing to do, did he? Went along with it, just like Adam did. Anything else anybody wants to add before we go on to the Naboth's vineyard story?
The name Baal is reflected in that BEL at the end is with reference to Baal.
You mean her name?
The name itself, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's like in the Muslim culture where at least all the men are all named something God. Abdullah, servant of God, all those names that end with LLA are all something of God. So she had a name like that,
Yeah.
except that it was Baal instead of God. Right?
So one thing, just framework-wise, this is God's people, Israel and part of Israel, and this is the equivalent of, granted, they weren't very godly at that time. However, to the nations around them, they represent God. This is like the church. This is like having the churches gotten divergent from God for a while, and then the head elder and his wife. And this is the framework. And so, I think it's useful to mention because so often we look at our world and they call us hypocrites, and yeah, we're all hypocrites at some level, but we're trying to do what's right. And And I think looking at the church is supposed to be perfect. This is what happens to the church when it gets away from God. And so we all have to be vigilant and careful. So.
Okay? So I'm going to move over to chapter 21. I guess we'll just read verses 1 to I guess verse 19 is probably far enough. Does anybody want to take on that whole thing? Or should I split it up? Why don't I split it up? Verses 1 to 8. Who'd like to read verses 1 to 8? Go ahead.
Sometime later, there was an incident involving a vineyard belonging to Naboth the Jezreelite. The vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or, if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth." But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." So Ahab went home sullen and angry because Naboth the Jezreelite had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." He lay on his bed sulking and refused to eat. His wife Jezebel came in and asked him, "Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat?" He answered her, "Because I said to Naboth the Jezreelite, 'Sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place.' But he said, 'I will not give you my vineyard.'" Jezebel, his wife, said, "It is how you act as is this how you act as a king over Israel? Get up and eat, cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed a seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters she wrote, "Proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people. But seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them testify that he has cursed both God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death." I'll finish reading it. So the
Okay.
elders and the nobles who lived in Naboth's city did as Jezebel directed in the letters she had written to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him and brought charges against Naboth before the people, saying, "Naboth has cursed both God and the king." So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Then they sent word to Jezebel, "Naboth has been stoned and is dead." As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, and he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive but dead." When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up and went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, "Go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard, where he has gone to take possession of it. Say to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Have you not murdered a man and seized his property? Then say to him, this is what the Lord says. In the place where dogs lick up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours.'"
Okay. So, let's talk a little bit about what should have been the, I guess, doctrinal foundation of what's happening here. So Naboth doesn't want to give up his vineyard. He says, "Why should I give you the inheritance of my fathers?" Does anybody remember talking about anything like that in the last class or two? Because we did. In one of the passages we looked at, this very thing came up. Do you remember the daughters? You know, the daughters, the father had no sons, and the daughters, do you remember that conversation?
This is where you respond. So you ask a question and then you say, "Oh, it's this."
The women were allowed to inherit the people within their tribe.
Right. And what was the one restriction on who they could marry?
within their tribe.
Yeah. They could marry someone they wanted to marry, as long as he was within their tribe. And the reason was, what? Remember?
Did they each tribe's land?
Yes. Yes. And that goes way back, way back to when the Jews first came in, the land of Canaan. Remember, there was that whole thing with Joshua and Moses about how they figured out which tribes were going to live where, you know, to kind of keep things fair, divide up the land. That's still supposed to be honored. And Naboth, you know, either he was aware of that law or it was just because of the tradition of the land, I don't know. But he wanted to uphold that law. And Ahab, who should have known better, was perfectly happy just running over it. So that's one thing that's going on in this story. So, Jezebel. Thoughts? How does she match up to the woman in Proverbs or God's design for Eve? Cordelia?
Well, I think it starts with the weak leadership of her husband. I mean, he was upset, he was sulking, and he was just going fit, not eating, and I mean, it's just, you know, he was not really strong and anything, so she took over. I mean, she did an evil thing, but she helped him. She took over, she helped. If it was a good thing, she would support him and helping him in his weak days and doing something for him to solve the solution. But in this case, it was a bad thing. But yeah, he did not show leadership, and she probably overstepped the boundaries, or she did overstep the boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, laying on your bed sulking, refusing to eat. I mean, most of us parents can relate to that with kids up until they're what, Chris? What age does that?
37.
No, you're not supporting me. You're not supporting me, Chris. No, I mean, it's very sad, but it's almost comical. You know, the king of Israel sulking and laying on his bed because some guy won't give him his vineyard. Come on. And yes, his wife just walked right through that door. She could have, perhaps in a godly way, even asked him, you know, in a good way, well, is this really the way the king of Israel should? I mean, she could have done that. And, you know, what about what it says over here in the law? And there are all these things about the king, how he's supposed to be a godly example. He's supposed to know the law, which would include honoring another man's property. She didn't provide any of that moral support. In fact, she encouraged him in the wrong direction. Yes?
I think it's also the leadership is she's getting what he wants so she can get what she wants. It's this exchange. Because she knew he wanted this, so she worked hard to get it to happen so that later on when she wanted something, she could have it. In fact, the end is the same. Both will have dogs licking what's left, and hers was testified exactly where it happened, and it happened that way. It is interesting the choices she's making. I'm going to get what I want, and we see that in other places too, where we encourage the wrong thing to get what we want so we can go further. Because when she did this, then what complaint could he have? She did this for me. He took possession of the place. He didn't say, you're wrong for doing that or correct her at all. He went along with it.
But it's interesting, I just to add on to the 2 points, in at the end of the chapter when God speaks to the prophet comes out and what does he say to Ahab? You have murdered Naboth. He was sulking. It sounds like he's not even aware of the plan until after it happened, because then his wife comes back to him and says, all right, now he's dead, now go take his possession. But he is given responsibility for this action that his wife made, because he, as Cordelia's pointing, wasn't leading, wasn't doing what he was supposed to do, and his wife steps in and he basically says, fine, go do whatever. He is now responsible for her bad actions, which is true and general leadership standpoints, like we talked about the priest earlier, but I mean, I think that's.
So how does that tie in with our discussion of Adam and Eve in the garden when they sinned? Do you remember when it happens, what does God do? Do you remember the whole chain of events, the blame shifting? Who did God go to first? Adam. Have you eaten of the fruit which I commanded you not to eat? She did it, right? But God went to Adam first, and it's very interesting. We see exactly the same dynamic here. Ahab really should have known better. As far as Jezebel's commentary here in verse 7, she says, "Is this how you act as king over Israel?" Now, what does the context of this story and that question say about her view of what a king is?
He's dominating.
He's dominating.
He don't have anything he wants.
He can do anything he wants. So this is the non-Jewish Oriental authority. If I want to cut off your head, I'm going to cut off your head because I'm the king. And that's where she was coming from, right? The Sidonians. They were not Jewish background. They did not have the Jewish law. I don't know what their rules were about kings, but her view is, you've got the power, you can do anything you want, good or bad.
Well, and they were both from a lineage of kings. I mean, you know,
True.
he wasn't voted into the position because he was a competent leader. He became king because he was born into that role, same as she. She was the daughter of a king.
Right.
So they, not that it's an excuse or anything, but, you know, she was probably raised with that mindset.
Probably so. And it's her heritage that dominates here. He's acting like a Sidonian king would act, apparently. At least the way she thinks a Sidonian king would act. Not the way King David acted. So even though he has the lineage, the foundation, the ethical foundation at this time is completely fallen apart. Which is really a shame.
One just notes along these lines, the kings of Israel were required by God's law to hand write out the entire law before they stepped in, or as they stepped into office. That was a requirement, which makes them, not only are they aware because they've read it, but they've actually written it out, which takes a lot of time and effort and helps sear it in the brain. So if he had followed that role, which I'm pretty sure he didn't, but we don't really know, he would at least have been aware of the problems with Naboth, with exchange, with other issues, but either way, he still is culpable for his actions.
So anything else you think we can pull out of this passage, in the context of our class? That we haven't mentioned so far? Yes.
I think that if he had stepped up with his role as the king, when he took her as his bride, if he was living the laws, if he was following the laws, being her as a daughter of a king, they were treated pretty much the same. They had to follow the king's rule. So if he took her as his wife and he guided her and brought her into the ways of Israel and under the laws of Israel, she very well may not have turned into this evil thing that she continued to be. She could have, most likely would have very well folded under the king, because if he had put his foot down as a king, like she said, is this how a king acts? So he opened the door completely for her to do whatever the heck she wanted.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, choose your mate carefully. You cannot assume that if you marry someone who doesn't believe in God or whatever, that you're going to be able to change them. And Paul warns us about that in the New Testament. There's no guarantee. I don't think Ahab made any effort in that direction. Not as far as we can tell. He should have. Cordelia.
I just wanted to say, it's easy for us to judge the whole situation, but I can see myself if I really want something and I'm really blinded and I'm sitting there, and if it's a job or anything, like, well, why don't I get this job and everybody else does, and, you know, I have to do what I have to do, and, well, why don't I get promoted, or whatever, or whatever it is, or why don't I find the right husband, or whatever concerns us, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, dear, no problem, I'll take care of that, you just sit here and wait, I'll do it for you, I'll make sure you get that job, or whatever. I mean, it's very easy to say, okay, well, thank you, yeah, why, you know, just to have somebody take care of you and don't worry about it, and take that responsibility away from you. I mean, it's very easy and comfortable, and,
Yeah.
and probably if you want something bad enough, you don't really care how they get it for you, because they're doing it. My hands are clean, you know, they're doing it, at the end I have that job, and everything is dandy. So I really can see myself too in that as a human. I mean, we discuss women, I know that, but also to make a point.
Sure.
It's very easy to see yourself, to be in that situation, and really have somebody take care of you, now really worry how he does it or how she does it, and just be happy at the end, presumably.
We're not above temptation.
No.
Roberta?
I think, I mean, even though her goal and her motives were wrong, she actually did exhibit a lot of the characters of the Proverbs 31 woman. I mean, she took initiative, she saw a problem, she set about how to solve it. She, you know, came up with a plan. She's like, I have a plan, let me take care of it for you. She wrote the letter. So those were all positive qualities for the Proverbs 31 woman.
Yeah, you're right. And the fact that, you know, that she has these connections with the elders and the nobles, of course, she is the queen, but, yeah, I mean, that's a very
The
interesting
same as
slant on
Esther,
it.
because, you know.
That's a very interesting slant on it. It's true. I mean, she was in the same position of Esther. And she used a lot of the same things Esther did, but she used them differently.
Yeah, so it's just the motive wasn't a godly motive, and it
Right.
was wrong, but.
She could have used those
She could have used
powers to
those.
do good things, but she didn't, at least not in this case. Cordelia?
Maybe as we can ask a question here, if we go about the women, what should a woman do in a situation where her husband does not show leadership? I mean, every man has his weak moments, and so what should we do as women? Should we step in and solve the situation, or like you said, you know, point them to the direction, say, come on, you know, look at the law, and what should you do, and you know, maybe there's no right or wrong. I'm just putting that question out. How should we women support our men if they are in a low and don't, you know,
Yeah,
help
there-
them out?
It's our New Testament theology part.
There is at least one example in the Old Testament of that very question that we are definitely going to look at.
Like that, maybe there's not a right and wrong answer.
I mean, it's a difficult situation. I think there are godly ways of handling it, which, well, I mean, we need to discuss that, but.
I'm writing it up here as a question for the
Yeah.
reason that we are definitely going to deal with this question. It's very important and it takes time, but we really want to get through a lot of the rest of the theology background, I think, before, because it's a great application question. So I think once we get through some of our theology, these will be some of the key questions we're going to deal with. So I'll write it up here. We'll keep it up here as we go through the next few weeks. And it's probably about 6 or 8 weeks out. So if you got a problem with Myron, come talk to me afterwards.
Thanks, Chris.
Love you, Myron.
That's you now.
Very good question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Very good question. Yeah, we do need to talk about that a lot and really think about it. So, but as far as this passage are concerned, is there anything else, or is there another Old Testament woman you'd like to talk about?
Well, we could look at Abigail and how she handled the situation much differently.
Okay,
If you want.
you can do that.
Probably good cross.
Good segue.
Good segue. Is that happy everyone's shifting? So
Abigail was on Chris and my list, people that we definitely did want to talk about. What time is it anyway?
We have about 10 minutes, a little less than 10 minutes.
So we can, do you happen to remember offhand exactly where that is?
That's in 1 Samuel. On chapter 25, yeah.
So today we'll probably have time to read this account. Maybe if you'd like, you can read it again during the week and kind of refresh your memory. We probably will not have time to really discuss it very much. But why don't we just divide it up? So, who would like to read verses 1 to 8?
What chapter?
This is, I'm sorry, 1 Samuel chapter 25 is Abigail. So I'm looking for a reader for 1 to 8.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Mon. A certain man in Mon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing at Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. While David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favorable toward my young men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever he can find for them.'"
Okay. Now, could somebody read verses 9 through 19? Andrew?
When David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to these words in David's name. Then they waited. But Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to my men whom George and I do not know?" So David's young men retraced their way and went back, and they came and told him according to these words. And David said to his men, "Each of you gird on his sword." So each man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword, and about 400 men went up behind David, while 200 stayed with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, "Behold, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he scorned them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we were not insulted, nor did we miss anything as long as we went about with them. While we were in the fields, they were a wall to us, both by day and by night, and all the time we were with them, tending the sheep. Now therefore, know and consider what you should do, for evil is plotted against our master and against all his household, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him." Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread, and 2 jugs of wine, and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she said to her young men, "Go on before me, behold, I am coming after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal.
Okay, would somebody like to read, think we have time to read the rest of the
Yeah, I
chapter?
think
What do
we're
you
probably about that much time, so.
Okay, so if somebody would like to read verses 20 through just 20 through 31. Roberta?
As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "My lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. May what your servant hear what your servant has to say. May the Lord pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent. Now since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my master be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him to be leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant."
Okay, and then who'd like to read the rest of the chapter?
David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day, and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal, for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." When David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife, his servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "Here is your maidservant, ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants." Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 maids, went with David's messengers and became his wife. David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Laish, who was from Gilead.
Okay. So we'll discuss this next week. Sorry to leave you in a cliffhanger, but we're out of time. But look over the story during the week and, think about how it fits in with our class and how it begins perhaps to help answer this question that was asked earlier. What does a woman do when she's in this situation? This is one woman's solution. You want to close this in prayer, please?
Sure. Holy Father, I thank you for this discussion, and I thank you for these examples you've given us to open our eyes to your work and how we should live in your presence. Father, I pray for insight as we think more about Jezebel and think more about Abigail and the way that you use these characters in history. Lord, I pray that you would help us to end on the right conclusions that are truthful, that you would help us to glean good patterns and to shun bad patterns from what we can see. Lord, may you be honored in this. May you be praised. It's in your Son Jesus that I ask. Amen.